In today's lesson, we're going to look at more kind of bits of evidence of evolution and also look at extinction and how that occurs. So we're going to start with looking at biogeography, developmental biology and structural morphology, and then we'll move on to these final topics here. So in the last couple of lessons, we've really looked a lot at fossils. We've looked at how they're formed, the conditions that they need to be formed, different types of fossils, and also how we can date fossils, figure out how old they are. And now we're going to look at some, I guess, other evidence of evolution, but you'll notice that a lot of this ties into fossils as well, and how the fossil record, as well as some other things, give us evidence that evolution has occurred. So the first thing we're going to look at is this term biogeography. Got that in yellow because this is an area of study. It's a scientific field, and it's based on our knowledge that over time the continents of Earth have drifted apart from each other due to plate tectonics, which is, the fact that Earth's land masses are moving very, very, very slowly. And this is stuff you would have looked at, in earlier years of science. So if we look over here at the right, we've got 225 million years ago, the Earth's landmass was known as Pangaea. For those of you that like to break down words, pan means all, or kind of global, like a pandemic is something that's gone all over the world, and gea is like land, like geography. So this is all the land, okay? Then if we go 150 million years ago, Pangaea started to separate, and we ended up with a northern continent called Laurasia and a southern continent called Gondwana, or like a big landmass. And if you look very closely, the shapes of the continents are kind of there. This is going to end up being North America and Asia, and Europe would be in here, and then Africa, South America, and Australia formed from down here. And then if we move, more recently, 100 million years ago, we have our distinct continents separated, but then over time up until where we are now, they have separated even further to, look like the globe that you know. So biogeography is the study of the distribution of species as well as ecosystems. So, jungle environments, deserts, plains, all of those kind of things, mountain ranges, in geographic space and through geological time. So basically it's just looking at where different species are found, whether they are current species or extinct species, and seeing what kind of information that gives us. The ways that this is used as evidence that evolution has occurred, there's kind of two main ways it could be used. The first point is that fossils have been found on continents all over the world, so talking about current day continents, of the same species that were dated as being older than when continental drift occurred. So let's say we're going back, 300 million years ago, and there are species, fossils that have been found, in Africa as well as North America as well as in Asia. That would tell us that all of those things shared a land mass at some point. If they were land animals and they're not able to cross the oceans, then that would tell us that at some point they all lived on the same area of land before the continents separated from each other. And there are many examples of this. You don't need to know specifics, but these are looking at, very, very prehistoric, ancient species. The other way that this evidence can be used is that if we look at present day species, so species that currently are still alive, that are related to each other, but are found in different areas of the world. And a really good example of this is if we look at the emu, and which is obviously found in Australia. We look at the ostrich, which is native to South America, and then this bird called the rhea bird, which is native to Africa. These are very closely related animals, but they have evolved further in different parts of the world. So an ostrich and an emu are quite different now, but they shared a common ancestor, which tells us at some point, again, they all lived, on a similar continental landmass, probably Gondwana, and they migrated from that shared mass. Some of them ended up here, some ended up here, some ended up here. Then the continents drifted, and then they further speciated in those areas. So, the emu had adaptations that were great for Australia, and they were selected for. The ostrich had some adaptations that was great for the South American environment, and they would have speciated further. So they're now different species, but they are found in different parts of the world and had a common ancestor at some point. So I just want to go in and answer question 1 to do with biogeography. So we've looked at that. We're going to look now at developmental biology. Developmental biology is basically just comparing embryos across species. Similarities in embryonic development indicate evolution from a common ancestor. And I'm sure you've seen pictures of human embryos before and thought, that kind of looks like a tadpole. And this is true. All animals have actually very similar embryonic development. If we look here, we've got a bird, a reptile, a human, and a pig. In the very early stages, they all look very similar. Humans, have an embryonic tail that actually has vertebrae in it. We have gill pouches, which obviously, we don't have gills, but in that embryonic development we do, because we all shared a common ancestor that did have gills. Okay, so that's basically all you need to know about developmental biology, just comparing embryos and that they tend to be very similar because of the shared evolution. All right, we're going to look now at structural morphology. Okay, structure obviously being, physical structures, and morphology refers to change. Another term for this type of study is called comparative anatomy. So basically just comparing the physical structures of species. So this is really looking at the similarities and differences in the structure between living animals or with fossils if they are found. And as you would expect, generally, if there are similar features, and we're going to look at this further in a second, they tend to have shared a common ancestor. That is when we're looking at internal features like skeletal structures. Other animals will have similar features that don't share a common ancestor, and I'll explain that in a second. I think before we move on, it's really good just to have a quick recap of how evolution occurs by natural selection, just to make sure a couple of these things have really stuck in. So the first thing is obviously remembering that mutations are the source of genetic variation. So we need to get changes to the DNA, which creates new alleles that mean we have some variation. So down here, we've got grey mice and brown mice. If these mutations occur in germline cells, so in cells that will become reproductive cells, then those alleles can be passed down to offspring. Then the other key point is that selection pressures or selecting agents act upon the individuals in a population. So here we've got a predator now, which is a selecting agent or a selective pressure, and because it can see these white mice, it's more likely to eat those. And then those phenotypes that are an advantage are selected for, and over time we will see more of the individuals with the advantage. So really we're looking at a combination of DNA, so those mutations, and then selection. Okay, I've just popped into the quiz a past exam question. I want you to go in and have a go at answering that because it does show you how these kind of questions are brought up in the exam. All right, so you've looked over now at natural selection, and hopefully that is all ringing a bell. We're going to look at a couple of key components of structural morphology, or key things that we might see if we're comparing different species with each other. The first thing, and this is a really important term that you need to know, is we can get things that are called homologous features. Okay, these are features or structures that might look or function differently. We're talking about generally from the outside, but they actually derive from a common ancestor. This indicates a shared evolutionary history. Okay, so there's parts of DNA that make similar internal structures, but we might look or function very, very differently. A really good example of this is if you were to look at a human and a bat and a whale, you would probably say, don't look very similar, don't function very similarly at all. But if you were to take an X-ray of the arms of a human, the wings of a bat, and the fin of a whale, the skeletal structures are actually very similar. There's the same bones. They might be different sizes, but they all actually evolved from a common ancestor hundreds of millions of years ago, and as a result have similar bone structure, even if obviously we use our hand in a very different way that a bat would use its wing. Okay, so these are homologous features. Another thing that you might see if looking at the structure of organisms are things called vestigial organs. Okay, these are structures or organs that have lost their usefulness. So they're not really needed for, as a result of natural selection, we don't need those structures, but the DNA for them is still there, and so they will still be produced. So a common example of this is if you were to look at an X-ray of a whale has a pelvis. So do snakes. They don't need those bones. They don't have lower limbs. So they don't actually need those bones because they have tails. But way, way, way back when there were animals that needed that, the DNA for that existed, and that still exists there. Okay, there are things like the appendix in humans is considered to be a vestigial organ. Male nipples are not particularly needed anymore, but you still have the DNA for them, so they are still there. So that's other evidence that at some point these organs were used. They're no longer used, but they're still there. The final thing that we're going to look at in structural morphology are analogous features. Okay, so they're almost, I guess, the opposite in a way of homologous features. These are structures that have a similar function, and they might even look very similar from the outside, but they did not originate from a common ancestor. Okay, so the internal anatomy will be very different. A really good example of this is wings. Okay, so insects have wings, birds have wings, bats have wings, but the way those wings are formed is very, very, very different. So bats are actually mammals. Insects are insects, obviously. Birds are aves. They evolved from very different ways. Okay, so they don't have similar DNA making up their wings, but at some point they had similar selection pressures that meant that those wings were useful. Okay, so they had very different mutations that gave them wings in the first place, and then those wings were an advantage, so they were selected for. Okay, so it's kind of the opposite of homologous features. Just jump in and answer question 4. So just for each of the examples, linking it to whether it's an example of homologous features, vestigial organs, or analogous features. Another thing that you'll see in the fossil record, and I mentioned this in the last lesson, are transitional fossils. These are fossils that basically show intermediate species between an ancestor and an evolved species. They tend to have features of both different types of species. Okay, so they're often pretty weird looking animals to us because obviously we only know the newer species. Examples of this are things like species that have both fish and land animal features. Okay, so a lot of prehistoric species had, a tail and gills and could live underwater, and also had legs, so they could be on land. Another example are species with both bird and reptile features. Okay, so they indicate that kind of midway in evolution. Okay, this is going to lead on a little bit to what we just looked at with the features, but there's two, I guess, kind of ways that species can evolve. We can have divergent evolution or convergent evolution. To diverge just means to to move away. So if we look here at this example, we have a common species ancestor, and then divergent evolution would be when two different species start to change from that common ancestor and then further speciate in different directions. Okay, this is quite a simple little drawing for it, but I would recommend putting this into your notes. So divergent evolution is when there's a common ancestor and then they start to become more different from each other. Convergent evolution is almost the opposite, where two species don't have a common ancestor, but over time they become more similar to each other because of selection pressures and, you know, different mutations that give different internal structures, but they might serve the same purpose. So for example, birds and bats, they don't share a parent species. We've got mammals and aves. They're not similar evolutionarily, but they look quite similar and they function quite similarly. So they've almost kind of converged. They'll never become the same species because their DNA is very different, but they have evolved to be quite similar to each other. Just looking at this a little bit further, this is, like I said, evolution of different species from a common ancestor, and just really important to note that those populations speciate, which we looked at with that speciation episode. They become new species, generally due to the fact that they become isolated from each other and they have different selection pressures. Okay, and we'll look at that further maybe towards the end of this week. And we're going to look at this example in particular, Darwin's finches, which is a group of birds found in the Galapagos Islands that all came from one species of finch, and then they started to speciate and change quite rapidly because of different selection pressures found in different parts of the islands. You know, another obviously pretty common example of that is the fact that humans and chimpanzees have both speciated in different directions, you know, from a common ancestor at some point. Convergent evolution is when species evolve to share similar features or traits but don't arise from that common ancestor. Remember that mutations arise independently. Okay, so the mutations that lead to wings in bats and lead to wings in birds are very different, but they serve a similar function and they had similar selection pressures that meant that those features were still selected for. Dolphins and sharks are another really, really good example of that. You know, they look quite similar. They've got the long, sleek body, similar colouring, but dolphins are mammals and sharks are fish. Okay, so they have a very different evolutionary history, but both of them had the same advantages with certain traits. Another one is wolves and the Tasmanian tiger. Okay, so wolves are obviously mammals. The Tasmanian tiger was a marsupial before it became extinct, but you know, they look quite similar, but very, very different histories. So just jump in and have a go at question 5. Right, the final thing we're going to look at is extinction. Extinction basically is the loss of a species. Okay, this is something that is unfortunately happening at unprecedented rates these days due to human influence, but extinctions have always occurred. And you could kind of break it down to looking at how individual species become extinct, and then also mass extinctions, which are the extinctions of many species at once. So the things that could lead to extinction of individual species are things such as, you know, competition for resources. Okay, if two different species share the same food source and one species is stronger and they always get the food first, the other ones are likely to die out because they can't eat. Predation would be another one. If there are predators that target a certain species, that could cause that species to die out. Changes to environment is a really big one. So a good example of that is the woolly mammoth, which, during the times of the Ice Age was extremely well suited to the environment and, was a bit of a keystone species then. But then the Earth warmed, and all of a sudden having this really thick skin and this shaggy hair and being kind of big and slow was no longer an advantage. So they became extinct because, they were too hot, they couldn't find food, and most of them actually died from dehydration. And then obviously the impact that humans are having now, so things like loss of habitat through human extinction, that's a big issue. I guess another one you could add in there would be poaching, which would be, predators, but those predators being humans, which is, something we're seeing a lot around the world, the white rhino being a big example of that. And then, of course, all of these things could kind of lead to this point, which is that you get decreasing population sizes, so you've got less individuals, less opportunity to breed, and then eventually they die out. Okay, so if there's not enough food, if there is not enough habitat, the numbers will slowly kind of dwindle, and then eventually they will die out if there's no opportunities for them to continue breeding. Mass extinctions, which is looking at the extinction of many species, are things that occur due to kind of global catastrophes. So examples of that being, the Ice Age. The Ice Age would have meant that many species died out because they weren't suited. And then I guess coming out of that would be the climate change when the Earth warmed, then would have meant that species that were struggling to survive before actually thrived now, and a lot of the other species died out because it was too warm. Things like volcanic eruptions have caused mass extinctions in certain areas. And then obviously things like asteroid impacts. So about 65 million years ago, it is estimated that a single asteroid resulted in the extinction of 70% of all species on Earth at the time. Okay, and that's how things like the dinosaurs went extinct. Even if they were very well suited to their environment, this was kind of a huge catastrophe that was unsurvivable. You don't need to know these exact mass extinction events, but it is quite interesting to look at them. Particularly, these kind of things like the asteroid impacts and the mass volcanic eruptions as the Earth changed led to huge wipeouts of the population. You might have picked up the very somber part of this, but looking at the probable extinction of Homo sapiens at some point. All right, to finish off, I've put some past exam questions in the quiz. When you submit the quiz, you should be able to check your score, and in each one I'll put what the correct answer is and the justification for that, so you can check that against your responses. All right, thank you.